Leadership isn't what we think it is, and it never has been. The last thing I want is more war. The last thing any of us do. We want to get it done. I knew that Afghanistan was getting worse, not better. I go in to take over. I'm not going to ask permission. We're just going to do it. Nobody above me was giving me anything other than try to beat those guys.
Torture, is it ever effective?
Well, the question is it effective? Will people talk? Yeah, people will talk. The problem is we lost so much national credibility, I think it's never worth it.
How do you explain the collateral damage?
It's just one of those things that you can never become cavalier about. You have to think of them as human beings, not as numbers. You know, my job is to accept responsibility, which I did.
So 6 months later, it kind of unravels, something you thought would never happen. The Rolling Stone magazine article.
It portrays my team as sort of this locker room annex, dismissive of the senior administration. A general's job is not to put a crisis on the president's desk. He doesn't need that. And so I offer my resignation, he accepts it.
And he never quoted you in that article.
No, he didn't, but I own it. I'm responsible, it's my team.
I've got great admiration for him and for his long record of service in uniform.
If we don't like something in our business that we're in or our politics, the first thing we should do is go look in the mirror. What are my values? What am I prepared to do? Because you have agency, you have responsibility. It's our role to decide that, and where we go is really up to us.
They say that the human race is doomed, that we have lost touch with our true nature, that the media has corrupted us, and that the planet has no future. I disagree. I believe that humanity is full of hope, and that our salvation lies within each one of us. My name is Brian Rose, and my job is to listen, the oldest method of learning known to man. Each week I seek out individuals that are changing the world, people who are living and thinking in a different way. Their stories will challenge your beliefs, make you question your choices, and perhaps inspire you to change. I never planned on doing any of this, but now I can't stop. Join me on this mission and make humanity something we can all be proud of.
I won't lie. It's very intimidating when a four-star general walks into your studio, and that's what happened here. General Stanley McChrystal, the author of Leaders, Myth and Reality, walked in. He was a pivotal figure in both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, personally responsible for capturing Saddam Hussein, killing one of the top-level leaders of Al-Qaeda. He then went on to Afghanistan and was unceremoniously fired by President Obama after a 34-year career. And then he went and rebuilt himself. He created the McChrystal Group. He went to teach at Yale, and he talked all about this stuff during my conversation, including Abu Ghraib, which was the prison that he oversaw, and all of the bad press that came with that. He was raw. We talked about torture, about leadership. I know you're going to enjoy this incredible conversation with just an amazing man, and I think it's going to teach you a lot about who you can be. And that's what we do inside the London Real Academy. I teach leadership because it's time to lead yourself. Stop making excuses, stop the procrastination, and go ahead and start that business, start that podcast, get up and publicly speak, or change life habits, your eating, your movement practice, your meditation. That's what we do inside the Academy. I personally mentor you, and here's a bit more about what we do.
London Real doesn't stop when the conversation ends. You see, that's when we get started. Because everything begins with a thought, and then comes the action. The London Real Academy is our global transformation platform. Here we bring together thousands of students from over 75 countries. Whether you want to build a profitable business from your passion, or learn to speak to inspire, or broadcast yourself with your very own podcast, or accelerate your life to become a high-performance person, we have the online accountability course and personal mentoring program that will make your dream a reality. Join us, and we'll take your life to the next level together. Our next accelerator course is starting soon.
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is General Stanley McChrystal, the former four-star general who served for 34 years in the U.S. Army. In 2003, you were directly involved in the capture of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In 2006, your forces were responsible for the death of al-Qaeda leader Musab al-Zarqawi. And in 2009, you took command of all American coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following your public retirement in 2010, you became a senior fellow at Yale University and co-founded the McChrystal Group. In your new book, Leaders, Myth and Reality, you explore what leadership really means, debunking the many myths. General, welcome to London Real.
Thanks for having me, Brian.
What's it like being in London from a military perspective? Because I'm sure I don't see it, but it must be everywhere.
It is everywhere. I mean, you walk down the street and, of course, statues. There was an era when, in Great Britain, Age of Empire, the 19th century, first part of the 20th, where statues really represented everything. And for me, that's romantic. I can't help it. I go through Admiralty Arch. I had been to some of these places in meetings when I was on active duty, and so you go by and there's personal memories, but then there's this just amazing amount of history. And you allow your mind to go back even further to 1940 and the Blitz and things like that. And so it feels almost like a military town, even though it's a city, it's a capital city.
Yeah, it is interesting because it really is a lot of military here. Trafalgar Square, the HMS Belfast is parked right in the Thames. I mean, you know, you wouldn't see that in DC or other places. I mean, have a full-on warship there. I mean, this country is steeped in it. You can still see the shrapnel scars down on the Thames of, you know, some artifacts from Egypt that were there in the bombing of the 1940s. I mean, it really is a big part of this culture, isn't it?
Yeah, it is, and it's part not just of the legacy, but about what makes Britain Britain, and what makes British people feel so proud of their heritage.
Right, and you're kind of a Navy buff, even though you're an Army guy, right?
Yeah, that's strange. The age of sailing ships, particularly the early 19th century, Horatio Nelson and Hornblower and all those stories, and I always just found that really interesting from a leadership standpoint. Captain out on the sea and with a tremendous amount of autonomy, but also making a teamwork. Because I think there were 850 sailors on Admiral Nelson's ship. And this constantly changing thing with 26 miles of sails, or 26 acres of sails, trying to coordinate this thing and then get it into battle and fight a 100-gun ship. It's extraordinary.
850 people on the same boat, right? What a management nightmare.
Think about it. Multiple decks, different backgrounds, smoke, pitching seas, enemy fire coming in, and you're trying to do all this.
I want to get into this book, but I also still want to talk a little bit more about you. You know, when you see Nelson on the top of that column and the guy with the one arm and, you know, there's pictures of him dying on one side of Trafalgar Square. I mean, you must have thought about some of the things you talk about in your book, you know, the myths and the realities. I'm sure you must have looked into some of British naval history.
You can't help it because they're iconic. And of course, Nelson's iconic. Here he is, I think 5'7". He'd lost an eye, lost an arm, and yet he leads the nation, or the nation's Navy, in this battle, particularly the pitched battle at Trafalgar. And of course, romantically, he's killed during the battle. And then his force goes on to a huge triumph. So it's almost the epitome of heroic leadership. But when you peel back on it, he was a heroic guy, but there were many more sailors flogged as they left Trafalgar coming back to England after the great victory than we want to admit. So, I mean, it was also, there was a tough side to it. Right. And he was a tremendous, I want to say, decentralized leader. He viewed his captains as entrepreneurs of battle. So what he did was he had these middle-class captains in the British Navy in those days. And it was different from the French or Spanish Navy, where you tended to have people of more noble birth. British middle-class captains were steeped from the day they became a midshipman, in how to sail a ship. And so they were masters of their craft. But they also, how they made their retirement money was taking prizes, because they divided the prize money among the crew, with the captain getting the biggest amount. So captains were entrepreneurs because they were patriots, and they were entrepreneurs because they wanted a good retirement. Wow. And Nelson understood the psyche of this, and so what he did was he gave very broad mission type orders. And then the famous order before the Battle of Trafalgar that said, no captain can do very wrong if he puts his ship alongside that of the enemy. And he's basically saying, you guys sort it out once it gets in the fight.
Right, so go for it.
Exactly.
That's what he told them to do.
Exactly.
And interesting, I didn't realize there was kind of a capitalistic, side of that too. So not only you get the victory, but you can get the bounty as well.
Exactly.
What a capitalism at its finest, right?
And what they found is more noble or wealthy captains who were put by position in the French and Spanish Navy didn't do as well, because there wasn't that same drive.
Interesting. Wow. And so the whole point of this book, from what I understand, is to try to debunk some of the mythology of these leaders, so we all can, first of all, not ask our leaders to live up to be these mythological people, and to accept them for their flaws and their attributes. And so we all can step up as well and become leaders. Is that a reasonable summary of what
It really is. If you think about the leaders that you've studied in history, superficially, they are perfect. Julius Caesar, Robert E. Lee, George Washington, you pick one and they're perfect, which almost discourages us from trying to be that, because you see this mythological person and you go, well, that's great, but I could never be that. When you get close to the reality of those leaders, in fact, it's much more approachable. It's much more realistic. They are flawed. Julius Caesar comes to the Rubicon River, and we think, crossing the Rubicon into Rome. He takes the 13th Legion, and we think he's decisively crossing the Rubicon. Actually, he stops on the near bank and frets over it. He hand wrings, should I go, should I not go? And then when they cross the Rubicon, it's ankle deep. So it's not nearly as dramatic an event at the moment, nor is he as decisive a leader as we want to believe. But at the end of the day, he makes the decisive move, and he goes on and becomes the dictator of Rome.
Right. So these people were capable, but history is written by the victors. And so we rewrite them to be even bigger than they are.
And we rewrite it because we want them to be bigger than they are.
Right.
There's a tradition in biography to treat the subject as the star of the play. So you put the spotlight on them and you follow them through their life. Well, with a spotlight on that central person, everything else is slightly in the shadows. And so the other people around them, the other factors, get minimized. And that person becomes the central thing in each scene. And in reality, that's not how things work.
Right. Tell me about your own leadership, because you said something really interesting, I think, on one of the interviews, where you said, I don't even remember events of my own leadership correctly. Yeah. As in, I thought it was this, but when I look back, it was something else. That's very honest. But I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit.
Sure. You know, we all fall into this mythology of great leaders. And as I got more senior, as more people start telling you, oh, you were a great leader, there's a danger you start believing it.
Okay. Why is that dangerous?
Well, because once you think you've got the right answer, you've figured it out, there's a certain arrogance. It's not intentional, a lack of humility. And humility keeps you listening. Humility keeps you learning. Humility keeps you sensitive to the things around you. I don't want to say that it makes you paranoid, but humility makes you careful that you don't already have the right answer. When I wrote my memoirs, what happened was I thought, okay, this won't be hard because I was there.
Right.
And so we did all these interviews to get more details on things that had happened. And what we found was most of my memories weren't wrong, but they were totally incomplete. And so I would make a decision and then there'd be an outcome and I would get credit or blame and I'd say, okay. But then when we did the interviews, we found many, many other people did things in many cases that actually had much more to do with the outcome than anything I did. And so as a consequence, I started to say, well, I'm in the play, but maybe I'm not the star.
Okay, what was the biggest example of that?
Well, we went after one terrorist in Afghanistan and I had given the order to go after Abu Abdullah, Mullah Abdullah Lang, and he was a one-legged Taliban leader, a really tough guy.
Right.
And so we had to do this operation, and I'd basically given the order, get him and go after him here. Okay, and we went after him and we got him. In reality, what I'd given was completely wrong initially, and so more intelligence came in, people modified, they didn't do it the way I had suggested that they do it, yet we got the outcome, so I sort of basked in the how smart am I?
Right.
And in reality, all I'd basically done is unleash them to do the right thing, and they made it happen. And for some reason, you know, in the march of war and things, I just never got the details in the moment. And so, but it's helpful to get it later.
Right, but it's also your job to take ownership of the good and the bad for whatever happens. I mean, that's something,
right.
That's something that you've always done.
You have to. And people worry about it. They sometimes don't want to delegate decisions because they're afraid they'll be responsible, or some people, if something goes wrong, they go, well, actually, my people below that did that. There's no point in that. I mean, you just have to accept responsibility because you are responsible. You certainly take the credit when it goes. And so it keeps faith with the people below you just to say, it goes with a position, I accept it.
Okay.
It's life.
I want to ask some leadership lessons, different points in your career. Take me back to the 70s at West Point.
Yeah.
First of all, what's it like at West Point? And also, what was it like back then? Because for civilians, we probably have this version of what you guys do in there, but what is it really like? And I'm sure you learned a lot of these core lessons there.
Yeah, I did. Many of them sort of kicking and screaming. I got to West Point in 1972, which was a pretty interesting time. It was the tail end of the Vietnam War. So the U.S. Army was badly damaged. The superintendent was relieved of command right before we got there for cover-ups with the My Lai massacre.
Wow.
So there was this sort of pall over the officer corps in general, and the faculty then was all young officers, many just recently back from Southeast Asia. So they represented that. And so the military was lacking confidence. They were worried about integrity. We hadn't done very well in some things in Vietnam. And so West Point was, on the one hand, steeped in long-term tradition, so there was a lot that just was continuing on. But it was trying to examine those lessons and try to be appropriate for the future, correct problems before they occur later. So it was also a time when getting into West Point was a little bit easier because it wasn't as popular.
Right.
So I tell people all the time, I got in the Academy's easiest year ever to be admitted. And here I am. But at the Academy, it was an awful lot of tradition of do things the way they had been done under Sylvanus Thayer, who's considered the father of the Academy at the beginning of the 19th century. Daily recitations, a lot of discipline, a fourth class or plebe system that involved hazing and that sort of thing. Some of it was absurd, but the idea was you put people under pressure, both in that fourth class system and then the whole 4 years, pressure of time, pressure of performance, and you make a better officer. Some of that's correct. There's an awful lot of that that's absolutely correct, and things that I learned and qualities that I think were at least begun in me go back to that.
Okay.
And there were other parts of it that were not as well thought through. In fact, hazing plebes and whatnot taught people some negative leadership lessons. You can't haze soldiers in the Army. They won't put up with it.
Right.
And so there's not much point in learning how to haze plebes at West Point because you're supposed to be preparing for the Army.
And you'll pay for it later as a leader anyways.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So there were some positive and negatives, but for me it was very good from the standpoint of it forces you to be organized. It forces you to get things done. It forces you to be on time. And those habits, I still fold the underwear in my drawer. My wife laughs at me, but I developed a lot of pretty helpful habits that have stuck with me, and I think there's value in that.
Yeah, I've had some great people in that chair, and most of them have great daily habits. You know, I know you get up early and go for your run, and you know, I'd be really shocked if there was a great leader out there who didn't have his own personal great habits. You know, I think that's crucial.
I think you have to. It goes with self-discipline. When I look at what I consider really effective leaders, and there are some exceptions, they tend to be fairly organized in their lives. Now, there may be parts of their lives they don't consider important, so they don't worry about, But the things that they said are important, maybe their health, maybe their reading, maybe their that sort of thing, they tend to be intentional about it, and they tend to be disciplined in its execution.
And I think something you say in the book, it's great to have a leader that spells out the mission and gets the team together and shows them the vision, but it's the daily practice that the team and the troops watch, and they watch you like a hawk, and they watch to see what you do, and that's where it's all about being, congruent with what you say and what you do.
In the military particularly, but it's true elsewhere, people watch you on a daily basis. You're always leading. So if you come out and you say, okay, everybody, we are going to do this, we're going to take the organization in a different direction, or something, they go back and they add in all their calculations from what they see, and they decide, can they do it? They look at Brian and they say, is he capable and willing and committed to taking us to this? And if they do, then you get a completely different level of commitment from them. And if they go, no, this is the fad of the week, or we started last time and then Brian lost interest or whatever, or Stan just didn't have the courage to do it, they discount it.
Right, which means it won't get done.
Exactly.
Take me on to Special Forces. You were attracted to this. You went on that journey.
Yeah.
Why is that something that's attractive to a young man, or did you want to push yourself, and what did you learn?
Yeah, I think the first thing that's attractive about anything that's elite is you want to see if you can do it. Plus, you want to be one of the cool people.
Sure.
And so I had watched war movies and whatnot, and I had become very interested in trying to be Special Forces, a Green Beret. So when I was a first lieutenant, I'd been in parachute infantry in the 82nd first, and that was good, but it was the 1970s Army, and it wasn't as good as I hoped it would be. A lot of problems. Mm-hmm. But then I went to Special Forces.
Again, they're not being congruent with what they're saying and what they're doing.
Exactly.
So you're not buying in as much.
And that's a big problem, because if an organization says, we are elite, we are at the best at what we do, and then you get in that organization and you find that's not true, there's a tremendous disappointment. And it's at what we call the say-do gap. There's a difference between what we say and we do. And the cynicism from inside your organization comes from that.
Okay.
And so I wanted to be in Special Forces. I had, watched Vietnam, unfold and whatnot. So I went there in late '78 as a first lieutenant, and I was remarkably disappointed, because Special Forces at that point was out of Vietnam, and it was really at the lowest point. It wasn't very professional. I mean, there were some good people in it, and we did some good things, and I learned some good things, but the difference between what I had hoped it would be and what it was just massive. And so I liked doing it, but I realized this is a shadow of what I want to be. And yet I wanted to be in really good organizations. I wanted to find a place where I thought I was part of something that was truly special, world-class, as professional as it could be. I later found that in the Ranger Regiment. Right. But it gets to why people want to do it. And again, I wanted to ensure that I could be the best, but I'll be quite honest, I also wanted, when I walked around, I wanted people to look at me and think, he's one of the best.
Right.
I wanted that aura to cover me as well.
Right, that pride.
Yeah.
And then deep down inside that we don't cut corners. We really are the best inside.
Exactly.
And so were you an agent of change inside there, or were you just, I'm going to the Rangers and...
When I was in Special Forces as a first lieutenant, I was on my team, and I was, trying to do things, and I was happy with that. But the larger organization, I don't think I was much of an agent of change. I just didn't have a big enough vision. I was a smart-ass first lieutenant. I once told my major company commander, just step back and let me run my team, and I got it. And he fired me. It's the only time in my life I've been actually fired. So he fires me. So I don't know what you do when you're fired. So I go back to my team room, where my Special Force team, 12-man A team, and I tell my team sergeant, I said, I got fired, which relieved of command. Wow. And so I sat there and I was just kind of shocked. I said, what do you do when you get relieved of command? And then my company commander came over about an hour later, and he goes, I'm not firing you, but let me talk to you, young man. And he was really a wise old major. He was a great guy. And, he kind of grabbed me by, the collar and said, listen, here's the thing. You don't do that. And you don't ever do that in front of people, because I could and should have crushed your career forever. And he's right. But it was one of those good life lessons.
Wow.
So I was kind of a smartass. Later, when I went to the Rangers, it was an organization that was much closer to being what they said they were. They had this great reputation, they had these very high standards, and they actually lived them. Now, they didn't live them quite as well as I had hoped that they would. So there I did become an agent of change, one of several who were pushing to make sure that what we said we were, we actually did.
Okay. I want to fast forward to a few dates and just give me your perspective on leadership lessons and what you remember from them. 2003, capture of Saddam Hussein. I still remember watching stuff on the news. I just moved to London in 2002. I remember the statue falling. I mean, it's a crazy time. It's 15 years ago now.
Yeah.
What do you remember from that time? You're a very senior leader now.
Yeah. It was less than you'd imagine, because what had happened is, this was 7-8 months after the invasion. Saddam Hussein had escaped. And then there was this rising popular insurgency, people shooting rocket-propelled grenades and putting out improvised explosive devices. So we were losing control of Iraq. But it looked not very organized. And we thought at first that it were these old Ba'athist generals who had brought former military together, and Saddam Hussein is pulling the strings. Then the more we looked, it didn't really feel like that. It felt like less control by that, and instead the rise of what became Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But still, we thought we had to get Saddam Hussein because he was a symbol, and he was sort of unfinished business. So we worked really hard and captured him in December of 2003. A detainee started to talk, and then able to capture him. But as soon as we captured him, there's this moment of, great, maybe Iraq will settle down. But inside the force, we sort of knew intuitively he wasn't really the problem at this point. Right. The problem was now different. Right. And so we basked for a short period of time in the glow of that. The president called me personally and said, thank the unit through me. But we already saw Al-Qaeda in Iraq as arising, and we said the real problem is yet to come.
Right, which is what you worked on for the next 3 years.
Exactly.
With al-Zarqawi.
Exactly.
And hunting him. And things really changed. I mean, things got really hairy over there. And you're in a real leadership position, and you're dealing, what's it like when you're getting phone calls from presidents and dealing with the CIA? And I mean, this is a whole new type of warfare we haven't really seen before. That must be tricky to manage.
It is, and remember that all of us, as we go up through our careers, there's a first time for everything. And so I was a major general when I took command of Joint Special Operations Command. I go over to Iraq in the fall of 2003, just when it's starting to get really tricky. The first part, it looked like it was going to be straightforward, and then it started to circle the drain, as we describe it. And suddenly I'm dealing with the director of the CIA a lot. I'm not talking to the president a lot, but I'm getting conversations with him. I'm talking to the Secretary of Defense a lot. I'd never played in that stage before. And so I personally am figuring out, how do I fit here? How do I act? What do you do? I mean, it's all the little things. You always go into a meeting and everybody else looks really self-confident. I joke about this. You go in the Oval Office and everybody goes in, and you expect them to put their feet up on the table because they're trying to show, yeah, we hang out here all the time. This is where we watch the Super Bowl. They feel the same way as you do. And I'm sitting there thinking, wow, what am I doing in the Oval Office? This is a mistake. So you got to get over that sort of.
Everyone's projecting power.
Exactly.
Because they all have an agenda. They want to get something done. And
exactly.
All right. So it's really at a poker table there.
Yeah, and you kind of got to get over that, and then you got to be, act like you've been there before too. But suddenly you find yourself, and nobody else is going to do it. You have to sit at the table. You have to push things. You have to pull agencies that you think somebody else is going to do it, and it's not going to get done. So really, in the first part of 2004, I'd say for my personal growth, became a period when, as JSOC started to get its legs under itself for the fight against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, I started to get my own confidence in what my role was going to be. And it was much more active than I had expected. I expected to get orders and we would go do stuff. I didn't get any orders. Nobody above me was giving me anything other than try to beat those guys. And so that turned out to be great, but I had to build the confidence to say, okay, I'm going to get a hold of this, we're going to do this, we're going to change this. I'm not going to ask permission, we're just going to do it. Right. And the more you do it, the more comfortable you feel doing that, but it's a growth process.
Right.
And the whole command has to kind of grow with you.
It's probably a bit like being an entrepreneur. Like no one tells you how to do it. You can read all the books, but you got to kind of go in there and do it.
That's right.
And the more you do it, the more confident you become and the more credibility you have with other people.
That's right.
And the CIA is technically doing what the president says, right? And so when they ask you to do something, that's tricky because you're...
It's very tricky. And they've got an agenda and they've got a culture and they want to do it. They're not bad people, but it's not the same as DOD.
Right.
So you get a hold of the CIA and say, I want you to do this, or we got to do this together. And there's this initial, sort of hairy eyeball from each side and cautious stuff. And what we learned is you had to build personal relationships, which you proved that there was integrity and credibility and reliability. And those become the sinew that connect the organizations, because organizations can have professional relationships, but it all has to be held by that personal part. So that ultimately, if Stan McChrystal asks them to do or asks somebody to do it, they'll do it largely because of that, and vice versa. And so that was a real education for me. I thought that process-wise organizations did that, and they don't do it as much.
And the same in the corporate world.
Very much the same, as
so.
you probably remember from banking and whatnot.
Yeah.
It's about people eventually. You look across the table and you decide, do I believe that person? Can I trust that person? And you do it.
Yeah, I always used to tell my juniors in banking, I said, you sell yourself first. Don't sell the product. You sell yourself. People do business with people. They do business with you because I know you got my back. I can trust you. I can trust my business. You're going to look out for me. They don't do business with institutions.
It's funny when you're in the military. As you become senior, you get briefed all the time. So people are coming in to brief you, and you can never master the subject because as you're senior, it gets too wide, too arcane. Right. And so most guys who get effective at senior level don't really look at the slides. They look at the briefer.
Right.
And it's funny, and sometimes it'll be disconcerting to the briefer, okay, hey, sir, analysis on this. I can't analyze that. I don't have enough information. I'm analyzing you. I'm deciding if I think you're credible, and if so, your analysis and your conclusions are something I'll accept. And that can be, when you're first young and people do it to you, you wonder, but as you get senior, it's by far the most effective technique.
Yeah, no, that's powerful. That's a great lesson for anyone listening. I interviewed someone last night and they come in and I just take the CV and I put it in the bin and I just ask them questions. Tell me, what have you been doing the last 2 years? What do you think about this way? And I just watch the way they answer me.
Right.
And I get a good read on their character. And are they blaming other people for things? Are they taking responsibility? Are they admitting to failures? Are they showing lessons learned? That tells me a ton about how they'll behave in the field. How do you build relationships when you're in Baghdad or wherever and they're in DC?
Yeah, we did a lot of traveling, so when I would fly back to the States, to my headquarters at Fort Bragg, and I'd do that maybe once a quarter, and I'd spend a few days back, I'd go to DC and I'd go visit them. And I'd go to their offices, and I'd sit down and I'd try to, you don't do corporate dinners, that's not done in government, but you go to their offices, sit down, drink coffee, and you try to get eyeball to eyeball. So that was sort of phase one and pretty obvious. The next was we used video teleconferences really effectively. So other than phone calls, I don't like phone calls much because I like to see the person. We did a lot of video teleconferences with people. And so you're seeing their face, you can develop some level of rapport. And so you try to communicate with the person who you need a relationship with on a pretty regular basis. Right. So that over time, they start to think the relationship with you is of some value and importance. Then we did another thing that worked very well. We put liaison people with all the places that were important to us, which ended up being 76 different locations. JSOC put out liaisons. And in some places, we put 3 people to make one, so there'd be 24 hours a day. Yeah. And the idea was we put great people out at great cost to us. If you're an ambassador somewhere or a head of an agency, our liaison to you would be there all the time. And if you wanted something from my organization, literally if you whispered it, that person would hear it and would act on it. And the design was to build trust vicariously, i.e., that person's very responsive to you. If you said, well, what does McChrystal think about this? He comes and calls me directly, and he has authority to do that. He goes back to you in half an hour and says, Sir, General McChrystal thinks this, he's willing to do this. And he kind of looks at the liaison, he goes, you call directly to your boss? You know, you could talk. Says, yeah, we think our relationship with you is that important. Kind of like client stuff. And the reality is it started to build these trusted relationships. And we had liaisons who became literally indispensable to the organizations they were with because we needed that relationship.
Right.
The other thing it gave us was with all these liaisons out, we had this incredible network of information gathering. So we knew things were happening faster and in greater depth than ever before. And a liaison would go, hey, the CIA is upset with us about this. We could start to act on it just immediately and get it out. I hadn't anticipated that value, but it turned out to be really good to inform us with intel, but also inform us with the less hard intel, more attitude kind of things that matter.
Yeah, back to relationships.
Yeah.
And how do you manage all that? You can't be getting calls from 76 people on a daily basis.
You get calls from them whenever, because they go right to the top of the priority.
Okay.
Because the relationship with me and the director of the CIA is crucial.
Sure.
So if the LNO from there, he talks straight to me. Okay. Now, you don't get them every day from him. Then we have this big video, daily video conference in the command that allows to press. But that's up at the top of the priorities, because key to my role became that. Which interesting, you say, okay, if you're doing that so much, what are you not doing? What I'm not doing is the operational direction of things that I used to do.
Okay.
I pushed that down. Got a lot of people who actually are better doing that than I am. Much more competent, much more effective. Push that down, let the organization run what the organization does well. But there are certain things a senior leader can't give away, because the senior person at an embassy or an agency doesn't want to deal with.
Yeah.
They want to deal with the top, and they deserve that respect.
Did you miss not being involved in operations?
Yeah, because
that's the sign of a good leader, delegating something they like doing, but they know could be done better.
Well, that's right. I mean, you grow up liking to do that, and you feel like that's your strength. So you say, well, that's what I'm going to do, but that's actually not what you need to do.
Right. Right. Tell me about those next 3 years. I mean, you were credited with making some major advancements against Al-Qaeda. The big thing was finally the killing of al-Zarqawi. What are your thoughts on that? Or what was that like?
Yeah. I was part of an organization that changed fundamentally. And that was very few times in life do you get to be part of that. And I was part of the change, but I wasn't the beginning, end, or all of the change at all. It was the organization. What we did is we came to a conclusion in early 2004 that we had to change completely. And we're this very elite, purpose-built counterterrorist force. And we'd been, for 22 years of our history, we'd been very successful. So there's great inertia and open resistance to changing. But here we are facing Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which is fundamentally different. It's powered by information technology. It's got a different culture and DNA than anything we'd ever seen, and a greater scale. So we start fighting it in our traditional way, and we're doing well at the tactical things, but the scale of it and the speed of it means that the impact of what we were doing just was lost in all the other things that were happening. So we had to do more, we had to do it faster, and we had to do it better. And we couldn't change our traditional processes, our mechanical, industrial age processes wouldn't do it. You just couldn't speed them up that much, because I was approving every operation, you know, and sort of our cultural. So we changed that completely to push decision-making way down, pump information. Instead of information going to the top for decisions, information went to everybody simultaneously, not through the normal chain of command, which was pretty upsetting to a lot of people initially.
Sure.
So we did that, and the organization started operating like a human brain, or like a computer chip, a transistor. Information's flowing really rapidly. Then we could operate those operations down. My role changed to be, instead of being a part of that process, I managed the ecosystem in which that process was occurring.
Okay.
And that was important and valuable. And I wasn't the only person managing it, but it was the biggest thing I did, and the relationships out. And then as this little nuclear reactor goes faster and faster and more effective and more effective, we pick up more skill, more knowledge, and more insights on how to keep changing. And the culture of the organization becomes, whatever works is what we do. And so whatever doesn't work, we stop doing. Whatever works, we do more of, and we just keep going. And when that stops, we keep changing. So it changed the culture of the organization, changed my role, and we went from doing 4 raids a month when I took over, 1 a week, to doing 300 a month. And that was what was needed against that particular enemy.
Wow. And the killing of al-Zarqawi, that was a big moment. That was a big success.
It was, and you know, you always put down and say, it's critical to kill this guy, and it was, because he really was an effective leader of al-Qaeda in Iraq. While it was necessary, it was insufficient. And so we knew that as we got him, it wasn't going to end the problem because there was too much resiliency inside al-Qaeda in Iraq. There was always this myth that if you capture Saddam Hussein, if you kill Zarqawi, if you kill Osama bin Laden, the problem will go away. But what that gets at is the leader is not the beginning and end of the organization. The leader's the figurehead, sometimes more than that, but sometimes they're more symbolic than operational. And so we knew that we had to get Zarqawi because we had to prove we could. As long as he lived, he was both effective and he was a symbol of our ineffectiveness.
Right.
So we had this break in intelligence where we had a set of detainees, 12 detainees, and as we went through them, we knew we had 12 key leaders. It captured all at one moment. And we identified several of them as likely important, and then we realized one of them definitely knew something. And for 50 days, we interrogated him. And when you think interrogation, don't think waterboard. We didn't do any of that. What we do is you just talk to him every day. You put 2 interrogators with him, and they build rapport. We even had movie night with a guy. He wanted to watch a movie. He got to watch his favorite movie. And for some reason, it was The Exorcist. But anyway, so we build relationships with him.
Interesting.
And then...
just like leadership.
Exactly. And after 50 days, he decides, okay. And he leads us to Zarqawi's spiritual advisor. 3 more weeks of trailing this guy using unmanned aerial vehicles and people on the ground. And he eventually leads us to Zarqawi, and we're able to kill him.
Wow.
But even the day we killed him, we knew that that was going to be critical, but it wasn't going to be enough. And so we killed him in the afternoon, and we did 17 more raids that night to try to keep up the momentum. And we had fought 2.5 more years against his team, his organization.
How do you explain to civilians the collateral damage? People that maybe don't understand what's going on there, because he had family around him when you bombed al-Zarqawi. I mean, that's a conversation you must have to have a lot of times with people.
Well, on the mechanical end, there's the collateral damage. Everything you do, you calculate collateral damage beforehand. If you're going to drop a bomb, there's actually a computer program you run. And collateral damage is not just structure, it's obviously potentially innocent people. And so there was a set of rules of engagement that drove it. So we went to incredible efforts to try to minimize collateral damage whenever we could. Sometimes you accept it, and sometimes you say, we're going to do this, and there's either the possibility or high likelihood other people are going to get killed, and that becomes a value judgment that's kind of hellish to make. But you do it. When we went after Zarqawi, I believed that his family, his wife and children, were in the house. I was confident of that. I couldn't confirm it, but I was confident. So when we made the decision to bomb the house, I did that, with that assumption. I don't have sleepless nights over that. His effectiveness to the enemy and the horror that he brought, in my mind, clearly justified it. It's just one of those things that you can never become cavalier about. Right. You have to think about it. You have to think of them as human beings, not as numbers.
Right, but it is the logical military decision, and that's what you got to move forward.
Absolutely. Because
you're evaluating all the damage he's doing to the civilians around him and to your forces.
Exactly.
Okay. Abu Ghraib, you were quoted as saying that you met a lot of people in the insurgency that used that as a moment to kind of sign up. And I had actually a guy named Dr. Philip Zimbardo here who was involved in something called the Stanford Experiment in the 1960s. Where
I read about it.
Oh yeah, well, I had him here, and it was fascinating because he kind of set up an Abu Ghraib type situation where he took a group of Stanford students, split them in 2, said 1 were guards, 1 were students, said do whatever you want to do, and it soon turned into this situation where they were kind of demeaning these people. And he talked about it and how all humans could kind of go there. Your thoughts on what happened and how you could manage it and what you learned from it?